Ladies and gentlemen, let's carry on this, what I find fascinating, quite, intellectually stimulating and urgent discussion. My name is Larissa Lutsevich. I am the head of Ukraine Forum and Deputy Director of Russia and Eurasia. And I think personally, today you see on display an amazing cooperation of three departments within Chatham House, my colleagues Rashman and Creon. We are really, I think, coming at the strengths of what Chatham House is, to bring in diversity of knowledge and expertise for you to be able to take informed decisions. And I would like to thank you on behalf of Russia and Eurasia program for this. So going straight into what I was struck by the message from the Christia Freeland was this kind of winning back initiative argument, and saying that, there's an urgency. I have an excellent panel today, and I'm really pleased that we have Ukrainians in the room, literally and virtually. And something that Deputy Prime Minister was saying is not always the case, but it is the case in Chatham House, because we've almost 10 years ago set up a dedicated center called Ukraine Forum, exactly to amplify the voices from Ukraine and to recognize and research Ukraine's own agency. And I think Ukraine is, in this particular case, with regards to holding an aggressor accountable, making sure that international law is respected, is taking initiative, and we'll discuss that. And I'll introduce briefly the panel in the order that I will be having a conversation with, and you will be asking questions. So right next to me is Erkki Kodar from Estonia. He is the Estonian Undersecretary for Legal and Consular Affairs. Welcome. Next to him is Tatiana Hutor, who is from Ukraine. She is a chair of the Institute of Legislative Ideas, and also she has an extensive experience working with the Ukrainian Parliament, Verkhovna Rada, at the Civic Council of Expertise with the Committee of Preventing and Combating Corruption. So Tatiana flew all the way from New York, I believe, today, so Washington. So that was not an easy journey, but thanks for being with us. Then on the screen we have Zahar Tropin, who wished he could be with us in London, and I hope we can remedy that soon. He is an advisor to the Minister of Justice of Ukraine. He's an experienced international lawyer. He is teaching at the Institute of International Relations, and Zahar is the member of Ukrainian Association of International Law. So welcome, Zahar, to you. Next to Tatiana is Tim Ash, our own associate fellow, but also representative of the private sector. He is a senior sovereign strategist at the RBC Blue Bay Asset Management here in London. And last but not least, joined us also is David Jackson. David is senior advisor at the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center. We worked with David jointly almost now 3 years ago when we first started having conversations about reconstruction and rebuilding of Ukraine in Lugano. And one of our associate fellows co-authored a paper looking at the integrity of reconstruction. So you can see why we have this collection of people here. And I'll go straight away to Erkki from representing Estonia, the country that clearly took an initiative because it invests around 2% of its own GDP. It's #1 in the share of investment in Ukraine's defense and support in the world, followed by Latvia, and then there's Denmark actually picking up, and Finland. But UK compared to that is 0.31% of its GDP. So you could see who is walking the talk in a way. So over to you, Erkki. I would like to ask you, what would reassure also you, countries in the, NATO's eastern flank, what kind of initiative you see specifically on these, making Russia pay for its violation of international law and compensations for Ukraine?
Thank you. Of course, the old truth is that small nations always do things by per capita calculations, and that's where we get to the forefront. But of course, there's no discussion that we are walking the walk and talking the talk at the same time. In international relations, of course, where you stand really depends on where you sit. And of course, we sit right next to our aggressive and also a genocidal repeat offender. So that's if there's a question of whether we have skin in the game, like was in the previous session, one of the questions, then of course we have skin in the game. And even though one can say this, and this is a weird thing to say in the UK, yesterday we just celebrated 20 years in the EU. Proudly, we can say that if we weren't by now in the EU and NATO, we might have faced the same fate that Ukraine is facing now. So it is a strategic question of how we approach all of these issues. And I think what the previous session really focused on, and I'll most probably echo some of the thoughts of Minister Freeland and the panelists, but we talk about a lot where the funds are or where the money is or how do we get to it. But we also have to have this understanding of what is the strategic situation behind it and what are the practical implications of it. So I'll take around 8 minutes in my introductory remarks to kind of set the scene of how Estonia views this and where we are heading and how we see that, how it is more of a larger context issue as well. Because there is a blunt truth about Russian aggression in Ukraine. This is where a permanent member of the UN Security Council is waging war, aggressive war against a neighbor for over a decade now. And this Russian aggression has been deemed by the UN General Assembly in overwhelming majority as aggression. And at the same time, we are in the third year of very high intensity war. And I use the term we in full knowledge because it is not a war waged against Ukraine. The main aim is to redraw the European security architecture to the detriment of all of us in this room. And actually even to go further by way of restructuring the international legal order to Russia's interest. And in Russia's thinking, they are at war with the West. Make no mistake about it. They are not at war with only Ukraine. They're with most of the West. The question, which is the strategic one, is are we willing to accept that we are at war with Russia? Even though at this stage it is waged against us by other means. You can also see what's happening with the different hybrid operations in Germany, here in the UK, Estonia, Latvia, Finland, anywhere in Europe. And also, let's be blunt. Collectively, we have waxed and waned in our support for Ukraine. And even though we have put enormous pressure on Putin, so that only remaining cornerstone of his theory of victory is that time is on his side. We need to prove this argument wrong. That is why we attach high importance to the policies that communicate the continuity of our strategic cause, economic, military, political support of Ukraine with the aim of Russia's defeat and Ukraine's win. And this is actually where the frozen assets really come into the play. The way this war ends will determine the type of peace that we will have. We have to be more steadfast in our responses against all aggressors who undermine the international rules-based order, and to take action to deter Russia and others as to show that this is not acceptable. There are consequences for those who breach our common norms of behavior. Our strategy so far has been to raise the price of aggression through sanctions, isolating Russia in international forums, on organizations, and to explore avenues of accountability for atrocity crimes as well as the crime of aggression. Nevertheless, there is no question that Russia's aggression is also a basis for their accountability for the damages that they have caused and are causing in Ukraine. Their actions are brutal and a blatant challenge against the United Nations Charter and the rules-based order as a whole. Russia must be held accountable for the gravely undermining territorial integrity, sovereignty, self-determination, and inviolability of borders. And these are the principles that underpin the international order. And our common determination is to raise the cost of aggression, help Ukraine win the war, not just that Ukraine mustn't lose, Ukraine must win this war, and rebuild the country, and hence we must find a solution for the use of Russia's own assets to compensate for the damages caused, because they already have this obligation under international law. And we also have to act now to deter Russia and other actors in the future, like was previously mentioned as well. The general framework that was discussed in the previous session applies well in the case of Ukraine. We have been successful in finding new and innovative ways to use frozen assets by way of windfall profits. Now we are discussing the windfall plus mechanism. We are making good headway in this. But let's be honest, if Ukraine's cost of rebuilding is somewhere between €500 billion and €1 trillion, then windfalls are not just going to cut it. At the same time, Russia has an outstanding legal obligation to compensate for the damages, and as a repeat offender under international law, we know it has no history of providing such compensation. Therefore, we are in a legal, political, economical, and even a moral conundrum of how to proceed. But there's hope. The UN General Assembly and also the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe have already called upon Russia to compensate all the damages caused by its aggression. And of course, the latter has shown no willingness to do so. The G7 has emphasized, like we have heard today as well, that Russia's assets will remain immobilized until Russia pays for the damages. And the General Assembly of the UN has also recognized the need for establishment of an international mechanism for the restoration of damages, loss, or injury caused by Russia's aggression. And the Council of Europe, curiously, is taking concrete steps in establishing a compensation mechanism with the register of damages already set up and operational. There are also good...
Start wrapping up.
Yeah. But in the case, we have to always balance what are the different risks of how we proceed. And these risks are really at the forefront, what that we have talked about today as well. And we have to factor these into our decision making. One of the things that we always hear is that we are destabilizing the currencies of the G7. Mm-hmm. But countering is to the fact that we have already frozen those assets almost for 3 years in the future. The destabilizing effects have not materialized. If all the major reserve currencies decide to use Russian assets together, there are no adverse consequences because no credible and viable alternatives exist, actually. Secondly, they say that Russia would confiscate their nationalized Western property. As we have heard, they're already doing this. And that's 20 years ago how Shell and BP felt when that happened. It is a modus operandi of Russia. And of course, the case of state immunity, which really hasn't been touched upon today, which is an important principle in our day-to-day dealings as states. Nevertheless, Russia has international legal obligation to make full compensation in Ukraine. And the aggression is such a serious breach of international law that the international community as a whole is affected, whether by specially affected state status or erga omnes. And under such rules, we may take measures to ensure compensation. And since Russia has shown no willingness to comply with obligations, other states may take action in certain cases and also override state immunities. And finally, we have heard this argument by Christine Lagarde of European Central Bank that repurposing Russia's assets would start breaking the international legal order that you want to protect, that you want Russia and all countries around the world to respect. The counter-argument to that would be that the rules-based order is violated by Russia, not by us protecting it. It is a significant threat to the international order if aggression is left unpunished, and it would also show that deterrence has failed, coming to what is the deterrent effect. And on the contrary, as Professor Lawrence Tribe has said, using Russian assets will strengthen the international norm against aggression and discourage countries from violating that norm in the future. So in conclusion, there are always legal arguments for and against in these types of situations. It always boils down to the political will. Are we prepared to act to support our principles and our way of life when our values are challenged? Support for Ukraine is not a charity, it is an investment into international peace and security, and our bold step is necessary to uphold the fundamental obligation of international law and human rights. We must be brave to take decisions that help Ukraine win, but also to understand that there's a larger picture behind it. To stand up for international law and our own security, because this is also a question of our Western security. We must be able to face the moral question as well. If we are worried about foreign reserves going elsewhere when our core values are challenged, then maybe we have a systemic problem in our economic system that needs to be addressed, because that understanding deters us from acting in accordance with our own values. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very powerful, outline. And I think you covered everything, in a way of discussion that we had in the previous sessions and contributors. And I would like now to bring in Zahar. And of course, again, remind a little bit that we are in the midst of a very brutal aggression of a war. And I think Ukraine's foreign minister today said that just in the month of April, think about it, Russia has dropped more than 3,000 guided bombs, and many of them were dropped on the cities of Kharkiv, Sumy, Mykolaiv, South Kherson. I mean, the damage is horrific, and more than 600 civilians died in just 1 month of March. So the escalation is going up the ladder. Russia is escalating. It's not de-escalating. It's not showing any signs that it is looking for a peace deal. This is where we are, and this is where Ukrainian government, Zahar and his colleagues have to deal with. And I wanted to ask you, Zahar, how do you see this pursuit of asset confiscation going? What are some of the successes from Kyiv's perspective? What are some of the obstacles, and how can they be overcome today? Over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you for this question, and especially thank you for your remarks concerning the attacks of Russian Federation against Ukraine. Just yesterday, it was brutal attack against Odessa, and where the civil objects were targeted by rockets, and so the damage was awful. But returning to our topic and speaking about Russian sovereign assets, as general progress, I can indicate that now there is actually no real discussion about the legality of confiscation of Russian sovereign assets. This is a result of big work done by Ukraine, our partners, and especially expert community. I remind you that initially there were a lot of talks that it is illegal to confiscate sovereign assets at all. Some of the lawyers even stated that it is necessary to have decision of international court institution permitting to confiscate sovereign assets. As for me, this statement from the very beginning was very doubtful. To my mind, position was and is absolutely simple and strict. Such confiscation is legal due to the countermeasures concept. This concept is widely recognized by international law. However, some lawyers started to say that in case of Russian assets conditions for countermeasures are not met, respectively, it is illegal to confiscate them, even within the frames of this concept. We strongly opposed to these arguments, and the end in this discussion was made by several memorandums provided by distinguished international lawyers who clearly proved legality of countermeasures in case of Russian assets confiscation. As for me, full stop was made by Harald Koh with his statement that international law is strict about application of countermeasures, and international lawyers simply unnecessarily complicated the issue in recent times. Accordingly, now there is no doubt that we can confiscate Russian assets, and these actions will be in conformity with international law. Moreover, if we will apply erga omnes concept, international community is obliged to confiscate these assets as a response to Russian blatant violations of international law. Respectively, now the question is not whether it is legitimate to confiscate assets, but how these countermeasures can be implemented practically. Two levels of implementation are possible: national legislation and international agreements or international level. These approaches are not in contradiction, and they are to supplement each other. Moreover, I think it is important to develop legal grounds at both national and international levels on confiscation of Russian assets for them to form a coordinated system. Some steps have already been taken. Ukraine adopted very detailed legislation giving possibility to confiscate Russian assets. However, taking into account that there is almost no sovereign assets of Russia within the Ukraine, mostly this legislation is applied against sanctioned private persons who are supporting Russian aggression against Ukraine. The Canadian Parliament adopted amendments to the Canadian Special Economic Measures Act. The proposed these changes allowed government of Canada to confiscate assets of states and persons involved in the gross violations of international law, for instance, aggression. In March 2024, Switzerland Parliament decided to start elaborating legal frameworks for confiscation of Russian frozen assets. The work is going on. In Estonia, there is a draft law on confiscation of assets. As I know, the same situation is within the United Kingdom. There is a bill in the House of Commons regarding the confiscation of state assets. As you know, the last prominent step in this aspect was in the United States. I'm talking about the Repo Act that authorizes the confiscation of Russian assets located on the territory of the United States and their transfer for assistance of Ukraine, and which was adopted. At the level of the European Union, various ideas for using frozen Russian funds have been discussed for quite a long time. Today, there is only decision to separate accounting of surplus profits from the frozen sovereign assets of the Russian Federation. We are expecting more substantial decisions of European Union in this regard. For instance, about the confiscation of sovereign assets, and are trying to explain that there is no other real options except for this action, I mean confiscation of Russian assets. As you know, the difficulty is that the process of adopting legislation in a lot of states and organizations is not so fast and depends on the political will of the states in which Russian assets are frozen. And you can see outcome of this problem. Actually, we have active legislation in Ukraine, Canada, and now in the United States. However, it is not enough to have such legislation. We need its real application. Example of Canada is very showing in this case. Respective legislation was adopted in 2022, but still we have no examples of its application. I hope that United States will not repeat this situation, and Repo Act will be actively enforced by United States government. We do understand that one of the problems of practical implementation of national legislation depends on answer to the question where we will transfer confiscated assets. There are two answers on this question. States can transfer these assets directly to Ukraine, and or specially established international institution or institutions. Nevertheless, small remark, states can confiscate Russian assets now, but leave them within the disposal of national governments till the resolving of this question. Moreover, as I stated in the very beginning, it is strategically important that the policy of foreign states and confiscation of Russian sovereign assets is coordinated with each other and Ukraine. If we are going through the second route, I mean international instruments or international institutions, it is to be addressed by second level of legal instruments implementing countermeasures. I am talking about the international agreements or other instruments on international level, which will establish a mechanism of accumulating or transferring Russian sovereign assets. Confiscation is the only option. Even those discussions about collateralization or securitization of Russian assets cannot be done without confiscation, at least from the legal standpoint. So the point is on technical aspects, how to make such confiscation. And here we come to a very interesting situation. When we are talking with law guys on this issue, they are, and actually we hear that there is no legal concerns, but there are a lot of political and economic threats. When we are talking with political and financial guys, they are saying no political and financial problems, but a lot of legal concerns. Let's be frank. There is no real legal, political, or economic concerns. Those which are raised are very overestimated or can be mitigated by technical decisions. All these situations.
Zahar, sorry to interrupt. Just 1 minute for you to wrap up, so we can, because we still have. Just finish.
Okay, I'm finalizing. Yeah. All the situation looks like those who are making these talks are trying to find out reasons why not to confiscate Russian assets instead of finding technical mechanism how to do this. So our proposal is to stop these games and start real discussions about technical aspects of Russian assets confiscation to Ukraine, if yes, in what way, or through international instruments where those assets can be allocated or transferred. Compensation fund within the international compensation mechanism, Ukrainian recovery fund, Ukrainian support fund, trust fund, World Bank, other financial organizations, escrow account, whatever. We count on our partner supports in finding appropriate legal grounds for the elaboration of the above-mentioned approaches. Please bear in mind that confiscation of Russian assets will help to fight with Russian aggression and its consequences, and save thousands of lives in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zahar. I think this is a good idea for the next Chatham House conference, is to go down after there is a good decision at the G7 soon. We'll be able to discuss all the practical details of how this is actually going to work. Well, we only wish for that to happen, and on our part, we are ready to convene another meeting on this. Now I would like to go over to Tim and bring back the bit of economics and numbers. You know, when you think about the damage that Ukraine, you know, incurred just in 1 year of last year, it's roughly 75 billion. This is not just what is needed to fight the war. This is an annual damage that Russia causes by the type of war Russia is fighting, and clearly. The urgency is here. We've heard a lot about it. So how do you see also this kind of argument of public financing of Ukraine if we don't confiscate this? Can we publicly finance Ukraine through existing means?
Yeah, well, the session's been fantastic. Thank you for our colleagues at Chatham House for putting it on. From the earlier session, just one really point, victors don't pay reparations. Right? If Ukraine doesn't win this war, there's no debate about frozen Russian assets, right? There won't be reparations, right? And people talk about recovery and reconstruction. Again, there will be no recovery and reconstruction if Ukraine doesn't win. That's the reality, right? And you know, I'm a macro guy, macroeconomist. If I look at the numbers and I look at the moment, what it's costing to keep Ukraine in the war, it's about $100 billion a year. $100 billion. Yeah, that's the cost roughly of allowing Ukraine to survive, not win the war. 100 billion bucks, right? If you look at the numbers, it's 40 billion budget and balance of payments support. Read the IMF standby report, EFF recently. It's about 40 billion budget and balance of payments support, 60 billion military support. If you look at the breakdown of that 100 billion, it's about 50-50 Europe and the US, more or less. It's 45 billion Americans, right? The 61 billion that the US Senate finally got through gets Ukraine to the end of the year. With a Trump presidency, probably the US bit, the 45 to 50 billion, drops off a cliff, right? So the way I look at it is Ukraine has a financing problem. There is a financing gap in 2025 that no one's really talking about. As I said, the 100 billion is not enough to win the war. Yeah. Probably Ukraine needs 150 bucks to win the war. So who's going to fill that financing gap when the Americans walk away? What's the cost of Ukraine not being adequately financed? It's defeat. That's the reality. It loses the war. What are the consequences? And you know, the only solution to fill that financing gap quickly is frozen Russian assets. If we don't do it, Ukraine loses. That's the reality. And the counterfactual, I love the academic arguments by the opposition to this. It's wonderful. Semantics, right? But those people who oppose it don't tell me how is Ukraine going to be funded if we don't use frozen Russian assets. And the reality is we're not funding Ukraine adequately enough. It is. The US money falls off a cliff. And what do we need to fund Ukraine to win? That's the reality, right? And interestingly, the other angle here is a burden sharing argument and who pays for this, which I found extraordinary that no one's talking about. I'm amazed journalists don't talk about this, right? The reality is we have $330 billion of Russian taxpayer money in Western bank accounts in cash. You know, we can talk about the Central Bank of Russia, it's Russian taxpayer money. Meanwhile, our G7 allies, partners, whatever you want, are very happy to spend Western taxpayers' money to fund that 100 billion and to basically, I mean, it looks as though, because they're defending the $330 billion of Russian taxpayer money, that's a political scandal in my mind. And interestingly, when I go to UK politicians and I pitch this, I say, well, you know, we've got 330 billion of Russian taxpayer money in our accounts. You know, why are we spending our taxpayer money funding this war that Russia started and protecting that money? That's a brilliant idea. We love it. Let's do it. And what happens? We go to our Treasury, UK Treasury, European Treasury, Bank of England, ECB. I call it, there's like a European swamp, right, of bureaucracies that hate doing things that are slightly risky. And they basically gets kicked into long grass. You know, some of us have been arguing for 2 years post-immobilization, well, actually pre-immobilization and freezing, 2 years for this to happen. And it hasn't happened. Absolutely remarkable. Why? Because those bureaucracies have basically blocked it with arguments like the reserve currency argument. You know, I've been in capital markets for 30 years. It's my job. I'm an asset manager. We manage $160 billion of assets. I can assure you, the move to immobilize had zero impact, 0 basis point impact. Well, 0 impact on the dollar, on the euro, on bonds yields, on treasury yields, 0 impact, right? The market has already priced it in. It's very unlikely that Saudi or China are going to move their money currencies elsewhere. There's nowhere else that they can go, frankly. And if the Chinese move their cash out of treasuries, it crashes, they lose. It destabilizes local markets. The Chinese don't want that. It's not going to happen, right? But I think the important point, I think this is the message to Lagarde, is she shouldn't be worried about the impacts on the euro of utilizing frozen Russian assets. She'll be worried about the failure to use frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine because it loses. What's the impact of Ukraine defeat on the euro? I would say it's devastating for Europe. It's devastating for the euro. That's a destabilizing factor because tens of millions of Ukrainians will move west, undoubtedly. That will cause social, political, and economic problems in Europe. It will boost populism. Orban will probably try and take Transcarpathia. There'll be lots of potential conflicts within Europe around ethnic issues. Defense spending, you know, Russian tanks will be on NATO's borders. You know, forget about 2% of GDP. We'll have to go to 3%, 4% of GDP. That's hundreds of billions of dollars more on European defense spending. I don't think that's kind of good for the euro, right? I think that's a disaster for the euro. That's the message we'll be sending to Lagarde. I don't think we can afford to sit on our backsides and allow Ukraine to fail. At the moment, it's not been funded. That's the reality. And Ukraine will lose this war, you know, unless... And I think the reality is, the problem as I see it, the decision makers on the frozen Russian asset are the wrong people, right? They are the bureaucrats. They're not the national security thinkers. And I think in the end, the French and Germans, it's the kind of people that have misread Russia for a decade are still making these decisions, right? Because they don't ultimately realize the threat from Russia. They don't realize, and actually Macron maybe has changed the view, right? I mean, Russia is an existential threat to Europe, to European security, to European unity, to the whole European project, right? And unless we defeat Putin, you know, we all lose, right? And unfortunately, unless the West is willing to write big checks to fund Ukraine adequately in the war and give it all the armaments to win the war, and that's Western taxpayers paying, you know, it will lose. Or the only other, and I don't think there's the political will at the grassroots level to sell that story to our populations because of the cost of living crisis. The only solution is frozen Russian assets. That's the fact.
Let's wrap. I mean, I think they see a round of applause. I think you're absolutely right about the cost of inaction, and I think this is something we often lose out of sight. And also, I think just looking at it as an insulated case of Ukraine, for Ukraine, it's actually missing the big picture. I think fundamentally, as Putin is, as I said, escalating. He's not changing his war aims. He is in a conflict with the West because he's undermined to break the transatlantic unity, and he wants to break the backbone of the European Union. And this is what we are dealing at. And he will escalate along the eastern flank of NATO, no doubt about it. And we do know that the countries are preparing for it. It's not as hypothetical gaming. It's the security reality of Europe today. And I would like now to bring in Tatiana Hutor, who represents a very powerful Ukrainian civil society, a community that from day one is mobilized to defend Ukraine in different ways, from volunteering and supporting the armed forces to actually working intellectually, legally abroad with a big advocacy campaign to make Russia pay. So I would like to maybe, Tatiana, ask you how Ukrainian civil society is preparing for the moment when also the funds will come to Ukraine. I think it's a bit like the question of if, when, then if now at this point. And how do we ensure that, that there is, what is the vehicle Is this the EU facility? Is this the dedicated trust fund? How would you see it best, helping Ukraine now during the war, later on? What is the conversation in your community?
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for this wonderful question. It's a great remark that we have to put when instead of if we are talking about the confiscation of Russian assets. So as Tim has said, it's super important. We have to understand that there is no other option than confiscation of Russian assets, the full bank of Russian assets. Why? Of course, there is another option. But if we stay on the position, when we want Ukraine to maintain the defense, to curb the depopulation, and to make Russia at least think about to stop the war, we have to confiscate the Russian assets as soon as possible. So, thinking about the ways how we can use it, there is many ways how we can confiscate Russian assets or use Russian assets, and there is many ways where we can transfer it and how we can what options we have to propose to use these assets in Ukraine. But there is 3 important key points here. So first one, the amount of money that we can expect to get. So it really matters. The second thing is when we get this money, because all this serious talk started maybe 1 year ago, and still we are here still talking about all these issues. So it's important to have this answer on when we get them. And third one is we have to understand how sustainable is the support from our allies in different directions. Because if we understand that our allies will help us with the defense, that means that we can repurpose these assets for example, compensation fund, international compensation fund, or maybe for rapid recovery. If we do not have the answers on these 3 main questions, we cannot just answer and understand how we can use these assets. Because if we get 3 billion euros or dollars per year, it's one story. But if we just can get 30 or 50 billions per year, it's totally another story. So I will divide this possible needs that we can cover with the confiscation assets for 2 groups. First one is urgent needs, and the second one is strategic needs. Talking about the urgent needs, of course, there's 3 of them there. First is defense needs. Without covering defense needs, there is no need to talk about anything other, because there would be no Ukrainians on this territory. So we have to start from defense needs. The second one is restoring the energy grid. So without energy grid, we will not have people there and businesses running there. So it would be country in a war without people. So it's the other aim and goal of Kremlin's regime. So okay, we can fight with you, Americans, EU taxpayers may help you, but you will not have people who live in this country. So it's another thing to cover and to think about. And the third one, of course, it's covering budget deficit. So let's address the numbers. The defense needs. Ukraine's budget for 2024 allocates nearly $40 billion for the defense need. So, but if we compare it to Russian defense budget, it's 3 times less than Russian defense budget. If we want to have results, we have to increase our budget, but we do not have money for that. That's why we need this Russian money to use it to defend ourselves. So, of course, US aid slightly balanced this situation, but it's only in this year for the next 1 year. But we have to think ahead what we're going to do in a year. So, and the price of delay is really high. So for this half of the year, when the US aid was stuck in the Congress, Russia used this moment. Of course, it used it, and in results, Ukraine lost its many territories. And what is worse, Ukraine lost many soldiers, many people, so, and who could still be alive if we get that aid in time. So, and the same thing is worked with Russian money. So the second thing is the restoring energy infrastructure. I will not dwell deeply in this point, but it's one of the most critical one within all the rapid reconstruction needs that we have now. The cost of rapid reconstruction for this year is $15 billion. $15 billion. So, and why the energy grid is so important? In case this winter would be crucial, the moment of the energy reconstruction, like this point would be crucial, because now Ukraine deal with a choice. We have a choice whether maybe to warm people's houses or to give this energy to the companies and to factories. So, and it is disaster, and for sure it will lead us to another wave of depopulation, of emigration. So, and it's like not only like theory. I work in my legal think tank. I have two analysts who are mobilized now, who serve in the army right now. And there would be the third one who will go to the army by the end of this year. It's, if we are talking about the men, and I want to make them, maybe I want to see them alive, and I want them to work, to come back and to work in the analytical center and to work on legislation and policies for Ukraine. We have women, we have really strong experts in our think tank, and two of them are leaving by the end of this year, before this winter. You know why? You know why, you understand why. So because of these two main things. I will not talk about the budget deficit because I think we do not have much time, but I want to point and to address two strategic priorities. So it's a big reconstruction, and it's compensating the victims. Talking about the big reconstruction. So we all know this, sums that were published by the RDNA, and this 486 billion, but in fact we understand that the real sums is around 1 trillion. And recent 2 years, we used to talk about this reconstruction as a let's build better, let's build back better. But as for now, we have to think about let's build something safer. So Ukraine is a frontier country. It is frontier country, and it will remain to be a frontier country. So, but it depends which frontier. And now we have to decide this issue. So we have to build our infrastructure, critical infrastructure, social infrastructure, rebuild it, and not just rebuild it for the future. We have to live, and people have to live their lives, to run their businesses now, because otherwise our economy will just go down. Of course, in this year we have 5% up in our GDP, but because we have to understand it, because the downfall in 2022. So that's why we have to rebuild it safer, and we have to start it right now. And talking about the compensation.
Just the last point, yeah.
Yes, compensations. So in Ukraine we have a national level of compensation. There is like around 10 relief measures, and one of them is, I think the most popular one is e-recovery, for the e-reconstruction. People who lost their homes, they can apply for this e-reconstruction. But what's important here, they can get a maximum $5,000. So what can you do for $5,000 if you lost home, if you lost your house? So Institute of Legislative Ideas, together with Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights, we just developed, we had get an analysis, and we presented, and what we saw. In fact, Ukrainian national reparation, it's not like reparation, but compensation instruments, not covering the whole sum. They're not covering like all the damage. One story, it's a real story. So the old woman, in the east, south of Ukraine. The missile got in her house, and the house was without the roof. So due to this national compensation program, she got the materials to slate the roof, but she still doesn't have money for work, just to put it, to slate it. Yeah. So in fact, now talking about the rule of law. So when you're talking about rule of law, don't think about oligarchs, about Russian businesses, about businesses who may lost money because of confiscation. Think about these old women who live in the east or south. They're like thousands of such old women without home and without the roof and without money to reconstruct it. So think about it. And the last point. So Ukraine is trying to do everything it can, but of course, because of the lack of the hole in the budget, it cannot cover all the damages and compensate the damage to everyone. That's why we have to think about the international compensation mechanism and international compensation fund that will cover all the claims that will be filed to the International Register of Damages. As for today, only first category has been launched, and it's a category regarding this the housing, the people's housing. So there's around 1,500 claims has already been filled to this register. But we have to understand that the expected number of these claims is at least 300,000. Yeah. So, and we have to think how we will just make it compensated. And this register, I'm finishing.
Let's just, I'm sure people will come back to these questions, and it's under the Council of Europe, and the secretariats are starting now opening. We can discuss it. But I think you pointed out by all these different categories that the question whether there is actually a comprehensive strategy to fund Ukraine's, victory. This is the question, because we are patching in like this roof of the old lady, here, there, from crisis to crisis. Perhaps something that we should put all these pieces together and say, what is the comprehensive strategy to finance Kyiv, to finance, if it's so critical and existentially important for Europe. But thanks for bringing a lot of more issues to it. And now I'd like to turn into David, because obviously Ukraine has already started doing it domestically. Like Zahar mentioned that they've seized Russian mainly commercial assets. There was a fund for liquidation of consequences of Russian aggression set up that was accumulating it and then channeling it through the Agency of Reconstruction for big infrastructural projects. Let's just think for a moment the explosion, the detonation of the dam of Kakhovka and all the consequences of not drinking water. I think the city of Mykolaiv still remains without drinking water. So the water has to be, delivered by trucks. This is a legitimate question, and you looked at Ukraine's integrity and governance. Can Ukraine manage big projects like that successfully? Christoph Freeland was trying to answer that question. It was interesting, her answer. What gives you confidence, actually, in Ukraine's capacity, and what are you worried about specifically in regarding corruption in Ukraine?
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you. Really good questions. So what gives me confidence? So we try to keep track of the anti-corruption reforms going on every 6 months or so. The last summary ran to over 12 pages. So it's really incredible what is happening in the context of war, the number of reforms, but more than just technical reforms, the kind of foundations of more transformative anti-corruption are really emerging. We see it in the lack of impunity for elites now. People can't hide from prosecution, investigation. We see it in the emergence of anti-corruption as a social norm. People are much more willing now to take action, to organize collectively. We see it with Manifesto 42 and the businesses there. Far more intolerant of corruption than they were. We also see it in how the political incentives are now set up. So EU accession, incredible or a lot of pressure now to come good with reforms. So I think those deeper foundations, I think, and lack of scandals, lack of well, there were some scandals, but action against it, I think, has been really important. So there is this liquidation fund, and this seems like a pretty ready-made mechanism by which some amount of funding can be channeled through which. From an integrity point of view, I've been discussing with people in Kiev, is it fit for purpose in terms of integrity safeguards? I think the common answer would be almost or yes, but improvements are needed. It is transparent. So Tatiana's organization is one of a number of organizations which tracks what is happening, how decisions are made, and is part of meetings. It is pretty participatory. Community groups are part of decision making, and they have pretty strong methodologies. And the government has also shown that it will accommodate, especially civil society demands about increasing integrity. I think where there's frustrations is that some of the guidance is not mandatory, that they can still be circumvented. So people want to see some of the safeguards enshrined in some kind of stronger legal formula, and also more inclusion in some of the methodologies that the World Bank and others are developing. So I think we can, that fund, I think should be a basis of discussion. I think what we need to consider is what does this mechanism cover in terms of integrity, anti-corruption, and what doesn't it cover? And I don't think it covers the whole chain of implementation. Mm-hmm. So we know from other settings that a lot of the corruption can occur when projects hit the ground, get going. And I think the real concern, despite all this incredible progress, I think the real thing we need to worry about in Ukraine is the re-emergence of what your colleague John Luft describes as systema, this organized network corruption, which was the kind of modus operandi before the war, and which many successive governments tried to bring to the heel, but proved very resilient. So we have to disrupt systema from emerging. I think we need to look at, therefore, anti-corruption all the way down the chain. Local level is very important, even though really good things are going on. It's still a bit patchwork. Police, a lot of the corruption cases ultimately will be investigated by police. They don't have a great reputation. We need to think about supporting police reform. And I think the international community should reflect a little bit. How can our banks be used to facilitate assets leaving Ukraine? And also, private sector will be involved in reconstruction, which is a really good thing, but we have to ensure that they're held to really high standards of integrity.
Yeah. Thank you, and I think it's important that you mentioned the European Union and the membership membership process, because that is such a, almost ironclad framework, especially for rule of law. And we do see a lot of work done inside Ukraine by the members of parliament, by Ukrainian civil society, to ensure that the courts are cleaned up, that the attestation process of judges takes place, that the Supreme Court, actually, something very important, is fully reformed, because that is the ultimate, authority that safeguards rule of law and division of powers and the checks and balances, because this is where, let's be honest, Ukraine is still not fully consolidated as democracy. It takes generations and decades of that effort, and even, like we had a discussion, even all democracies backslide. But what I'm trying to say is that what was important, what you said, and then Prime Deputy Minister, that there is a demand for Ukraine, for anti-corruption effort in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian government will be under the magnifying glass. It already is through investigative journalism, and I think through European Union integration process as well, and IMF and others. They all have anti-corruption measures. To be in the IMF program, you have to comply and you have to implement a lot of steps. Maybe there will be more questions on that. Now let's open. We have 15 minutes. I'm sorry it took us a bit longer, but it's a big case of Ukraine and it is the case of the day. So apologies that we don't have enough time for discussion. Just raise your hand, introduce yourself, and let's just dive through it. I don't believe we answered all your questions in the panel. I'm sure you must have something on your mind. Yes, please, the lady here.
Given that we are in the UK...
Could you please introduce yourself?
Sorry. I'm Nicole Pichet from the Parliamentary Human Rights Group at the UK House of the Parliament. Given that we're in the UK, I would like a bit more reflection on the UK's position, which isn't, I don't know if it's anti as such, but it's very ambivalent. We heard the Attorney General say, you know, property rights are very important, and I know there's a lot of discussion in the government about the technical aspects, so I'm just wondering how you are all engaging with the UK government to get them on board to make sure they support a joint position at the G7 on repurposing Russian assets.
Yeah. Let's take more. Yes, please, over there. Yeah.
Hi, Martin Sandby from the FT again. Thanks a lot. Just a very quick comment and a related question. So how the money can be spent depends a bit on how, you know, what form the confiscation or other mobilization happens. So, for example, the European preference for harnessing the interest, they want to spend it on weapons. The US's proposals are repo is specifically for reconstruction. Mm-hmm. So we don't quite know yet what constraints will be put on that. Of course, if you fund one thing, you relieve pressure on another thing because you can shift fungible resources. But with that background, there's already been, if not a lot of work, then a lot of talk about how to manage reconstruction from the, what was it, the conference in Switzerland, I forget which Swiss
Ukraine
village.
Recovery Conference.
Yes, the Ukraine Recovery Conference, several editions. The multi-donor reconstruction platform, if I remember the bureaucratic name right. We've been talking about this for a long time, so I just want the panelists' view on how fit for purpose that work is. You know, is there by now a structure, as opposed to simply words on paper, that this money could be plugged into if necessary, or has it all been talk and we don't really have any kind of structure in place yet?
Great. Maybe I'll go to Zahar if you can say anything on your work with the British counterparts on the legal part. Do you feel things are moving forward? And then maybe somebody else has. Yes, go ahead.
I think that my colleagues will help me with this, but actually we do work with United Kingdom colleagues, especially speaking about lawyers and actually the lawyer support, also financial support, I mean expertise on financial issues. But of course, this is mostly of general recommendations and expertise. And as I mentioned, it helps us to overcome this general struggle against legality of seizure of Russian assets. But as I know, as I understand, the question is about the work internally within the United Kingdom. On this issue, we are relying, of course, on our official channels, but and I would like to take an opportunity and ask United Kingdom expertise authorities to help us to actually to propose our ideas and our position within the United Kingdom official authorities. Okay. To be some kind of our ambassadors in this respect.
I've seen you raising a hand.
We have, since Estonia already has a national draft law that is being deliberated in the parliament and has gone through the first reading, and the next two and the third readings will be in the next 2 weeks. We have shared our own legislation as well with the UK and other partners within the EU and across the Atlantic. But just to add, this hurdle of legislation, it is a tough issue. That's why it takes time. This Estonian proposal was in the works for over a year and a half, because it's not easy. you have to take into account European law, which under the sanctions have been levied, under which the assets have been frozen. You have the international law that you have to mix into it. You have to mix into your domestic law, as well as into your constitutional requirements. It is tough as hell. I haven't done anything more difficult in my career so far. It takes time. We made like 2 drafts that we just pushed into the bin because I understood that it wasn't constitutional enough. It is tremendously difficult, and that's why it takes time. But legality is important for our societies and our democracies, because we, instead of Russia, we have to adhere by the rule of law. We have to do our things by the rule of law. We have to use the legal requirements and the legal possibilities that we have, but we also have to be brave enough to use new challenges and new viewpoints on this. And on the reconstruction and damages that Martin asked, the system isn't really in place yet for the full reconstruction, let's say the Marshall Plan of Ukraine. But it is getting there, and I think by the end of this year it might get much more feet on the ground. I'm hopeful for that.
Yeah, just do something unconventional, because I know Tatiana is here, who was actually helping to draft the first draft of the bill in the UK that went through the first reading. Can you just briefly say what is really happening in the chambers here? Why is the second reading?
I was also involved in the group that advises at our Attorney General, so I won't be going into the detail of that legal advice because clearly that's confidential. In terms of the bill, I mean, the bill is public and it's been introduced by Chris Bryant in Parliament. It was a private member's bill, it wasn't picked up. I mean, what we were focusing on at the time, that was introduced in February 23, so that was the very first legislation of its kind. We were focusing on 2 things. First, making sure that there is transparency as to where the assets are located, who holds them, because, I mean, still we don't have that transparency here in the UK. And secondly, the legal way of confiscation. And of course, we are talking about state assets. We looked into private assets, and I agree that's the Estonian legislation, and that is incredibly complicated. And in the end, we abandoned that part of the bill. It was drafted, but we didn't feel it was strong enough to be introduced to Parliament. In terms of state assets, the key issue was to make sure that sovereignty wasn't raised as an issue, and that, of course, meant that we had to introduce it as an executive action. And the question was, and the same in Canada, there's a question of, well, how can we ensure that the rule of law and procedure is still complied with, where the executive has this power effectively to confiscate.
Thank you very much for bringing it up. Tim.
Yeah, in answer to the question about UK government, I wonder if anyone from UK Treasury is in the room. I'm afraid that says it all, frankly. I mean, you know, we have an event on seizure of sovereign assets.
In London. They don't have to travel far.
I mean, why is no one from UK Treasury here, frankly? I mean, it's a disgrace. I think it partly reflects the state of the UK post-Brexit and our institutional capability. I see that, you know, across government on many areas. It's really unfortunate, but that's the fact. So it's this idea that, you know, politicians, I mean, the interaction we've had with UK parliamentarians has been really positive. They want to do it, they want to get on board, and then it somehow gets into this bureaucratic swamp and it kind of disappears. Yeah. So, I mean, that's that. And the answer, the question...
Martin, on reconstruction.
Reconstruction, well, interest as well is interesting. I mean, I think the Europeans, I mean, basically, the interest return, as was mentioned already on Treasury, I mean, what they're invested in, it's 5 to 8 billion probably a year max. Doesn't touch the sides. We could think innovatively, we could invest it in a portfolio of EM assets, which could generate 10% yield, which would be like 330 billion order. I mean, my sense is the European project, or the European idea is just to delay, to stall, because they don't really want to do it. They don't want to do what they should do, which is allocate the underlying assets to Ukraine to ensure victory. That's the reality. Yeah. So I think it's a big fudge, and unfortunately, and on reconstruction and recovery, you know, that's kind of encouraging, but it's like 2.5 years later, how many recovery conferences we've had, right? I mean, what I argued long ago, you know, I think, you know, Ukraine needs a recovery and reconstruction agency like the EBRD, right? This project of Ukraine's successful recovery should be the most important thing since the end of communism, 89-91. It should be. This should be a project that's, again, existential for Europe. We have to make Ukraine wins the war, wins the peace, because it's the front line for us. Unfortunately, our politicians, no joined up thinking, no coordination, no big picture thinking, right? I mean, it's extraordinary. We don't have an agency, right? We created EBRD in 91. I was part of the first EBRD transition report. I wrote part of that, I wrote part of it, right? We created EBRD because this project was so important at the time, right? And it sent such a strong message that we are going to be successful with the transition. And it was incredibly successful. Okay, EU accession was also part of the story. But I think in the end, our guys, our leaders are not really taking this seriously enough. We should have this agency. It should be coordinating donors. It should be managing programming reconstruction. It should be an entity that can borrow on its own behalf. It could be a partner for investors. We've invested in Ukraine for 30 years. Biggest problem, okay, corruption, all that kind of thing. It's finding the right partner, not being screwed around, and then having, when the things go wrong, being able to go to the authorities and say, help us out. This kind of agency, I think, would be a champion for investors, and it would help private investors come to the country. But again, no joined up thinking. It's like staggering.
Right, so another one here, and any other hands? Yes, please. So Nigel, here. Eliza, Nigel, raise your hands because they don't see where to give microphone. Yeah, yeah. No, don't shout out. Yes.
Excellent panel, thank you. Firstly, Tim.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry, Nigel Gould-Davis from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Firstly, Tim, you addressed very directly and compellingly what we might call the Lagardian fear of turbulence.
Lagardian trap.
Lagardian trap, that's right, exactly. From drawing upon your profound insider perspective in the financial markets. And at an earlier panel, Tom touched on the same issues in alignment with your views. Now, my question is there a consensus? Is your and Tom's view more widely shared in the financial markets? Are there different views about what the financial consequences, including and particularly for the euro, might be? And secondly, if I can just quickly, for Erki, but also a Ukrainian perspective, so Tatiana and Zahar would be helpful. How is the diplomacy of these issues evolving in Europe, in particular among those countries which are both on or close to the front line and also are non-Euro members of the EU? And to put it at its crudest, and we spoke about this online a few weeks ago actually, you can imagine a sort of diplomatic pincer movement where the Anglo-Saxons on the one side and the Central East Europeans, Nordic Baltics on the other side, gradually squeeze France, Belgium, and Germany. What does that kind of look and feel like at the moment? Thank you.
I will not take any more questions because there's been a lot of good remarks from Nigel and to all of our panelists. So let's take these two questions. One on diplomacy, another on what is the view in the city on this? How converging?
I the asset management community, I've heard no objections to. I don't like these repurposing, right? I've been giving
confiscation,
immobilized, they're not even frozen, right? Let's be real. They're immobilized Russian assets. We haven't even sanctioned them. They're not even sanctioned assets, right? Yeah. Immobilized Russian assets to Ukraine. I've heard no back push or push back, I should say.
So who is doing the pushback? The banks?
I think, again, it's the banks. I don't even think it's the banks. I think Euroclear, let's be honest about it. I mean, again, journalists in the room, even the European project only talks about using the interest or the taxes on the interest earned on immobilized assets in Europe in distributions from 24. What about the interest and profits earned by Euroclear and Belgium for 22 and 23? They're sitting on them. That's 5 billion euros. Why isn't it already in Ukraine? I mean, that's extraordinary. And they're not, it's not going to be allocated to Ukraine. So, I just think, again, it's this inertia that is stopping this happening. And again, it's quite remarkable. 2 years, 2.5 years, two odd years after the invasion, we're not making progress.
And it's not like we have billions in the pipeline. The 6 months we've been stressed, dying and anxious about funds.
You can't
wait. We could have more of this calm hypothetical conversation under the circumstances of sustained funding, but there is no sustained funding, and 50 billion of EU facilities divided by 4 years. It's not 1 year funding, and that includes a lot of conditionalities, and there will be a lot of hurdles to jump over this. So just, a remark again of the timing of this. And just to wrap up, because I know we will have one more session, not session, but concluding remarks after that. Interesting question of diplomacy. So this inertia, there's internal one, but there's also national inertia, right, that you are trying to overcome with your efforts, diplomatic efforts. How is that? Do you see progress? Do you see alignment? Is there the unity of the outcome? Because there's a unity to stand by Ukraine, but I think sometimes there's a difference in outcomes that Paris would settle versus Tallinn.
I think there's a really difference of tolerating risk within the European Union. And it isn't really geographical in that sense, but it's more of a mindset. I'd say that how the EU works at this moment, like we see with the windfall profits, is that we cannot take the full plunge, but we will just dip our toe into the water and see, is it warm, is it cold? And if it's warm, then we might take the next step. That's how the EU works. It takes small steps, but then arrives at somewhere. I know that the Estonian and the Baltics, we have done a lot of outreach to European capitals. But what happens in these types of situations is that we might be a little too, let's say, on different ends of the spectrum with our positions. For example, Estonia's position on pros and assets and the use differs dramatically from the understanding of Germany in that sense. We actually need somebody coming from maybe outside the Nordic Baltic and more from Central Europe or Western, Southern Europe, kind of break this deadlock that we have in these types of situations. But that hasn't deterred us from our outreach, and we will still continue until, because we know that we are on the right course, and in the end, we will get heard. As Ursula von der Leyen has said, that we should hear the Baltics a little bit more. But I'd say that during these last year and a half, this sentiment has a little bit also settled into somewhere much more relaxed position.
Yeah. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, apologies. I wish I could bring more Zahar and Tatiana and David and many of you, but we will have to wrap up this session. So please join me in the round of applause to our speakers.